everyone. Hello, thank you, Bronson. Welcome to St. Paul's Episcopal Church. I think that I should say right now that Graham and I are both somewhat irreverent, so it's a high bar for us to be standing up here together. So we're going to try very, very hard not to say anything. That's right, it's the Episcopal Church. It embraces all of us, so there we go. I am so grateful to Bronson. It has just been an incredible resource to be able to move here when we sold out in about 5 minutes from a talk about fortifying a harbor, which I didn't think was going to go like gangbusters, but it sure did. So I am incredibly thrilled that we had the option of moving here. So thank you so much for being such a great neighbor to us. On your way out of here, or when there's actual daylight, go out into the graveyard and meet some of the people that we're going to talk about tonight, because they're buried right outside. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Graham McKay. So last year, I wrote down very carefully everything that I was told to say about him, and said it all verbatim, and then he introduced me with a complete work of fiction off the top of his head. So I'm going to do the same thing. So this is Graham McKay. He is wearing a shacket, which is both a sweater and a jacket. He bought it in Canada. What else can I say about you? He's the executive director of of Lowell's Boat Shop. He's a supermodel. He is the winner of the Best Chin Award from the University of Bremen. What else? And he knows an awful lot about vessels of all kinds, but particularly about wooden boats. And he's a great friend of mine, so now I'm going to let him introduce me with a certain amount of trepidation.
So I have to thank Bethany here for asking me to do this. Admittedly, prior to this, I didn't know a whole lot about the fortifications of Newburyport, but I did actually have some background. She informed me that I had some background. But you all know Bethany here, your leader, and she's actually runner-up for Researcher of the Year from the Daughters of American Revolution. I don't know if you guys know that.
It's not true. It's not true.
But
I should be.
I don't think the Museum of Old Newbury could possibly get anybody better at their job than Bethany.
Thank you.
The fun of this for me was getting to rifle through the archives down there to find a lot of the things you're going to see tonight. And Bethany has all of that kind of in her head. She has to go find the actual paper to confirm it, but it's largely there. So I don't need to tell you anymore how wonderful Bethany is, but you're about to experience it. Take it away, Bethany.
Yeah, nothing like over-promising so I can under-deliver. Thank you, Graham. I will say last time
this will be the best thing you've ever heard.
Great. Last time he introduced me as the winner of this year's Star Award from the Massachusetts History Organization, which was a lie. And then I got a phone call about 2 weeks later saying that I had won the Star Award from the Massachusetts History Alliance. I'm not kidding. So I was hoping he would introduce me as the winner of the next, I don't know, lottery, something. That would be great. Okay, anyway. You can see that this was fun putting together for both of us. So the events from now until the end of June commemorate and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution. They are part of a program run by the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism. So this program is funded in part by that body as part of their MA 250 program. So you can go to massachusetts250.org and check out the whole slate of programs all over the state. So they are hot on the topic of Massachusetts being first, because we really were. And Newburyport was even firster. And that's what you're going to find out about tonight.
Portsmouth was even firster.
It was even firster. Okay.
Before we hop in, should we say that there are printouts of these?
Yes. So this is not the biggest screen in the world. We will be sending out the slide deck afterwards. And there are a limited number of printouts at the back of the room if you'd like to follow along. There are, unfortunately, not that many photographs from the American Revolution. More is the pity. So you're looking at a lot of screens with writing on them, which I find fascinating, but are a little hard to read from the back row. So you'll just have to listen to the lilting sounds of our voices. All right. So I would also like to thank nothing we do here can happen without our long-suffering board of directors. So any of you directors here in the room, this is the museum board in a casual moment. Also my staff and volunteers at the back of the room serving you incredible piles of food. And of course, Graham McKay, right here, a couple of weeks ago. So I think he was in the Arctic when that photo was taken. Okay, so what I will say about Graham and I is that our organizations and our knowledge is better together. These are actual photographs of Revolutionary War patriots. I'm just kidding, it didn't happen. But one thing that, we did our first event together talking about the slate decalogue. I don't know if any of you were present for that. And it was such an incredible revelation to me because I have a lot of theoretical knowledge and I know a lot about the people in this community. And Graham has actual practitioner knowledge of the sea and of sailing vessels. He was a sailing ship captain. And we're actually taking it was really the depth of knowledge that could be brought to a maritime history topic by having a practitioner in the room is incredible, and that was true of this event as well. We're actually presenting together at the Council of American Maritime Museums conference in Pensacola, Florida. So
that's actually true.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is actually true.
Yeah.
We're taking Newburyport onto an international stage. We're going to do it. So it's a great partnership. Okay, I'd like to say a little bit about sources. So a lot of the sources that are available when you look at the Revolutionary War are from committees and boards and town meetings. And what you find is that a lot of the sources are expressing a wish or a hope, or they vote to make something happen and then you find out it didn't happen for 9 more months. So a lot of the research that we do is based on those sources, and then we try to verify with reports that the thing was actually done, usually differently than it was first suggested, and then bolstered with letters and other sorts of communication. So sometimes we only have the vote and we have to assume that it happened. Sometimes we have 9 different sources, but town meeting has always been as contentious as it can be today, and sometimes a vote is a wish your heart makes. So let's get right into it, shall we? All right. So the Boston Port Act, we're going to just set the stage a little bit. We're going to sort of leap forward in the process. You could go back as far as you wanted to set the stage for the American Revolution, but we're not going to cover all of it. But for our purposes tonight, it's important to understand the Boston Port Act. It was passed in March 1774 and enforced by June 1st, 1774, closed the port of Boston to all commerce, and ordered the citizens to pay hefty fines to punish them for the Boston Tea Party, for the destruction of tea. Again, since I only really care about Newburyport, it really matters to us because Boston is blockaded, and so all the shipping and trading that was going in and out of Boston can no longer do that. So that is important for us. So Boston to the south is blockaded.
My turn. So we have a ship involved, so I get to talk now. So Boston's blockaded, and we have our neighbors to the north up in New Hampshire to thank for bringing on the heat, shall we say. So in December of 1774, 74, yeah, a group of rebels, I guess, in Portsmouth took over the Fort William and Mary at the entrance to Portsmouth Harbor, which today is where the Coast Guard station and the lighthouse is on the Newcastle side. There was a fort there that was guarded by 6 men and a dog, and they were pretty easily overrun by the hundreds of town people that came out, and they made off with 100 barrels of gunpowder and harassed the guards there pretty bad. And then the next day came back and took away 16 cannon, and so that riled up General Gage, or General Gage?
No, Admiral
Gage.
Graves.
Oh, General Gage is another guy. Admiral
it's different
Graves in Boston. So he first sent up the ship Canso, and we'll talk about that later. But then sent up the sixth rate, the Scarborough, and she anchored just inside of where that fort is now. There's actually a pier on the site of where she anchored, and basically to shut down the port. So Boston, big seaport. The next big deep water port to the north excepting Gloucester really and Salem was Portsmouth. In a way, certainly if you know the Piscataqua River, you can get a ship way inland and you can take goods to all corners of New England through Great Bay. So the Scarborough was sent up there basically to shut down the harbor and harass the rebels of Portsmouth for having done what they did.
You have to sit down now, that's the rules. Okay, there we go. We had this all worked out. We had a whole little dance. Okay, so now we're back to people, so I get it. Okay, so on Friday, the 14th of April, 1775, so the Scarborough, Portsmouth has been blockaded for about 5 months now, and on the 14th, we have the first record that the blockade of Portsmouth has a direct impact on Newbury and Newburyport. And we see from the logbook of the Scarborough, the master and 7 men returned on board after being driven on shore in the above schooner beat to pieces on the back part of Plum Island near Newbury. So it says lost the above stores and saved only the schooner's sail and lower rigging. And what we know from that, what we know from the Scarborough, is that they had captured a sloop, a barge, and a schooner. And they were using these vessels to raid all along the coast. And of course, they wouldn't have said they were raiding. They would have said they were capturing illegal shipping. But they wrecked right off Plum Island. So what I'm trying to say is the threat is real. They're blockaded. We're blockaded to the south, and we're blockaded to the north. And now the north blockade is starting to raid us. And then we have this wonderful document, the Essex Journal, Friday, May 26th, so a month later. By the way, the April the 14th, this is before Lexington and Concord. This is early in this process. May 26th, last Tuesday evening, a barge belonging to the man of war lying at Portsmouth, rowing up and down the river to make discoveries with 2 small officers and 6 seamen. 2 small officers, I love that. The tars, not liking the employ, tied their commanders, ran the boat ashore, and were so impolite as to wish the prisoners good night and came off. The officers soon got loose and rowed themselves back to the ship. So if this is true, which I don't think it is, sorry, I think it's a piece of propaganda, but that tells you as much about it as if it was true. It is, they're all the way up the Merrimack River in their barge. So it's a scary time. All right.
Can I talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, go for it.
So these 2 small officers were probably midshipmen who in the Royal Navy were generally, teenage boys. And they would be sent on this kind of a coastal mission, certainly for training, but also they were somewhat expendable. But their job here was very likely to survey the river, sound the river so that the Royal Navy knew if they could actually get in or get out and know where the channel was. And that was probably the purpose of their trip down. But back in those days, it was no big deal to make that, what was that, about 16 miles trip in a 30-foot open, and I say open boat, basically an open rowboat, the barge.
All right, so by the time April 19th rolls around, we all know what happened then. Newburyport is on high alert with blockades and frightening news from north and south. And of course, April 19th is the day that everything gets really real. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the start of the American Revolutionary War, with the first shots fired between British troops and colonial militiamen in Lexington and Concord. Locally, it seems that Newburyport began hearing rumors of fighting in the middle of the day on the 19th, and really didn't know what to do with the news. Communication was so poor, they weren't sure that it was true, and so they started mustering the militia, and then they said, well, let's send a writer to Danvers and see what's really going on. If Danvers says it's happening, it's happening. And that's in fact what happened. They decided to check with Danvers first and began marching out in any case. But we have in our collection, and a big thanks to Sharon Spildenner for finding this, we have a record of the supplies that were sent with the Newbury men who marched on the alarm of the Battle of Lexington, which includes bread, shipbread, which is, hardtack, white bread, fish, chocolate, sugar, cheese, and then Anthony Davenport, innholder, who's running the tavern, receives them upon their return by making chocolate, entertaining the men, and 65.5 gallons of New England rum. Welcome home, boys. So it's not that strange to think that when a wild-eyed rider came galloping into Newburyport on April 21st, just 2 days after Lexington and conquered, shouting, turn out, for God's sake, or you will all be killed," the people of Newburyport took this very seriously. Many fled, crossing the Merrimack River into New Hampshire, and hid. It was, as we now know, a false alarm, but remember that just a week before there was a schooner wrecked on the backside of Plum Island, and information was wildly unreliable and delayed. On the same day that the Ipswich fright swept through Newburyport, Portsmouth reported hearing from Newburyport for the first time about Lexington and Concord. So the bloody news is on April 21st in Portsmouth. And the day after, Benjamin Greenleaf, who is the sort of reporter of our Committee of Safety, reported to his peers at the Hampton Committee that we were unhappily thrown into distress yesterday by false accounts received by 2 or 3 persons. So all I'm saying is Newburyport is wicked jumpy, and they have good reason to be. So Whittier wrote a poem about the Ipswich fright that was sort of humorous. And it ends, "Returned safe home, right glad to save their property from pillage, and all agreed to blame the man who first alarmed the village." But at the time, it was a much more frightening undertaking. So let's fast forward into June. You want to talk about these guys?
Oh, me?
I don't know.
Go
I can.
for it.
Okay,
Go
I'll do
ahead.
it.
Go ahead.
Okay. So here are 2 documents that speak to how Newburyport is seen from the point of view of the British. So in the top one, General Thomas Gage is writing to Vice Admiral Samuel Graves. So this is the land commander speaking to the seagoing commander. And he says, "Mr. Benjamin Hallowell informed me this morning that the rebels have vessels out watching for the trade bound to Marblehead and Salem, and to give them notice to put into Newburyport in order to avoid your ships, which I think is proper, you should get acquainted with, and it's assured from other information the vessels laden with salt have gone in there." So this tells us that Marblehead and Salem are considered unsafe, and they're already, on June 15th, shunting trade into Newburyport. John Wentworth, who is the governor of New Hampshire, the loyalist governor of New Hampshire, who is now hiding out on the Scarborough, reports that Captain Andrew Barclay has this morning seized the sloop Kingfisher, Jonathan Eaton, master, laden with 13 hogsheads and 3 tierces of molasses, bound from Newbury to Piscataqua for breach of trade. Now, so Newbury is also running trade, their blockade running into Portsmouth. So this is, we're becoming a real center of ingoing and outgoing trade already in June. The interesting thing to me is that he says exactly how it was done. The sloop ran into Little Harbor and unladed 8 casks into a gondola without entering or reporting at the custom house. So Newburyport boats are running themselves aground, dumping their stuff in, very much like what they did during Prohibition, dumping it onto a gondola and then getting out of there as quick as they can. What else happens on June 17th? It's the Battle of Bunker Hill. So as Newburyport's militia is away fighting, so all of the fighting men that could be spared are out fighting at Bunker Hill and dug in there. And at the same time, we're looking at a real threat to our port from the British. And I will talk a bit more about you will hear a lot more about Bunker Hill at the last session of this series. But let me just say, when I was doing a little bit of research, I came across this record, which is sort of a personal favorite of mine, so this is a little bit of an aside. I came across this eyewitness account of the Battle of Bunker Hill. It reads in part, "Mr. Little of Turkey Hill, who I have heard is lately made a colonel, showed great courage and marched with those under his command through 2 regiments of our men who were looking on at a distance, but were afraid to advance. He set them an example, it seems, which they did not choose to follow. He proceeded till he found our people retreating from the hill. Being much overpowered by numbers, he covered their retreat. He narrowly escaped with his life, as a man was killed on each side of him, and he came to our camp all bespattered with blood." That is Moses Little's house there on the left. It's just when you take a left on Turkey Hill to go by the artichoke. There's, ironically, a giant boat wrapped in the yard right now, and this is his headstone. It's right near my house. So that's an aside. Let's get back to the harbor, shall we? Okay, so right after the Battle of Bunker Hill, there's a huge flurry of activity around fortifying the harbor. So we see the first sort of, after every major engagement, there's a real flurry of activity. And there are numerous records of the town of Newburyport stationing a guard either on Plum Island or in Salisbury. At this point, we only know that they have guards on the sea entrance of the Merrimack River, so we don't know which side they're on. That is from a pension claim by a man in the 1830s applying for money as a Revolutionary War veteran. Then on June 22nd, 1775, Benjamin Greenleaf, who is, again, our correspondent from our Committee of Safety, writes to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, who have asked for their cannon and their powder back, their gunpowder. And he says, no, we're going to keep that. We're going to keep the cannon and the gunpowder, and this is why. Our stock is much reduced so as to occasion us great uneasiness, inasmuch as it must prevent our executing some plans we had meditated for the public good. Besides, many of our inhabitants are apprehensive of danger from cutters and other armed vessels. The Admiral, that's Admiral Graves, having, as it is said, given out threats. We've been at considerable expense in preparing light cannon for action, with 3 or 4 heavier cannon, which can be procured to defend ourselves against any attack by water. But all that we have done and are about to do will not matter unless we have a few barrels of powder. So, no, is what we're saying. And then on the 23rd at Newburyport Town Meeting, they voted to sink something into this river for the better safety of this place. And you can see that what they voted for, it says, voted that the affair of sinking more piers or not in the river, I love this line. This is the committee going back and forth on who should actually sink the piers. And then they actually vote on that the sinking of the piers should be left to the discretion of the committee already chosen for that purpose. I love that. Okay, sounds great. So this is what happens. Again, this is on the 23rd. This is the town meeting records, and you can see that there is item after item about the piers. They're all excited about the piers. So they say, essentially, that they are going to sink piers. They're not going to obstruct the whole passage of the river, so they're not blockading the river yet. So they're not looking at sinking vessels or chains and logs or anything like that. But what the heck is a pier?
So, it first said to sink something in the river, and the easiest thing to sink to block the river up is an old ship you've got lying around. The trouble is, especially in this river with the current, they don't tend to stay where you want them to stay when they reach the bottom of the river, and so it would have been a quick solution, but probably not a terribly good one. And this is British chart from 1775, actually, and you can see there's a distinct lack of detail in the river, and this was not uncommon. There are some soundings offshore, and when you look at the larger scale chart, there are soundings around Portsmouth, there are soundings around the larger ports, but a place like Newburyport, they would not have surveyed enough to put soundings, but also, if any of you are boaters in this town, you know, the mouth changes so frequently that it does you no good to put soundings on a chart that someone's not going to use for a year or two because it's all going to be different. And so the river itself has a lot of its own natural, barriers to entry, if you will. So from the viewpoint of a mariner, with the shifting sands and the bars and the tides, it's a treacherous place to get in and out of. But also, one thing of note is that for most of the year, the river runs brown, being a brackish waterway. So if you're coming on or into an unknown harbor back in the age of sail and you didn't quite know the soundings, you could send a boat out ahead of you, which is pretty slow going, or you can send someone up to the foremast and they can actually see in normal, fairly clear salt water, you can see the shallows and kind of guide the ship in, but you can't do that in a brackish river like the Merrimack. So they wanted to sink some piers. What is a pier? It's someone who puts pressure on you to do bad things. In our case, this thing's on. You can't see, but maybe in the next slide you can. So this is 1826. This is the earliest chart we really have of the river with proper soundings on it. There is an earlier one, but it's not in great shape, or I say it's not that detailed. But if you zoom in on this, you see sunken piers, and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 of them, 5 of them right there. And you can see a cluster sort of around. This is black rocks, so this is where Butler's Toothpick is today. So right off of there, you've got these 5 piers, and the main channel runs basically right around the outside of them. And what would a pier look like? So this is a crib pier, and this is somewhat conjecture. This is what I suspect they were, partly because if you look at the piers on the chart, they're square in shape. But this is the general wharf construction of the time. If you go out behind the sewer treatment plant at low tide, the big pipe that runs out that carries mysterious effluent runs right through an old wharf. And at low tide, you can see how that wharf was put together with cribbed timbers just like this. So it's very likely that they could hastily put together a crib work like this, bring it out, and then what they would do is sink it to the bottom and fill it with rocks, and there it would stay. And stay they did.
I love this game. Okay. So this blew my mind. Were you thinking when they said sinking piers that that's what it looked like? Some of you probably were. I had no idea. So they kept talking about logs, and so I'm thinking they're just jabbing logs into the bottom of the river, right? Because logs, sharpen a log. But no, they were actually making these structures, so that was amazing to me. Okay, so now we're in July. In July, we become obsessed with cannon. So we now are going to we're going to sink some defense in the harbor itself, and then we're going to try to fortify the shore right at the mouth. So on July 7th, we set a guard boat at the piers. So we've built some piers at least, and we've sent a boat out to guard it. We talked to Salisbury and Amesbury about a battery. Amesbury was like, yeah, well, you can pay for it, but you can defend us, but we'll send up a raft. That's what Amesbury says. Salisbury's a little more cooperative because I think they were actually getting a fort on their actual property. Again, the town records, the Committee of Safety voted to cause a small vessel with a convenient number of men on board to be placed near the piers that are sunk in the river. So now you see we have the vote to make the piers. Now we know there are actually piers, even though there's not a map, because we're sending people out to hang out near them. To prevent our enemies coming upon us unawares or from sounding the river to find the depth of water. That's what they're anticipating the enemy is going to do at this point. They also vote that Captain James Hudson advise with the committee from Salisbury and Amesbury on a suitable place to erect a battery. And then the Salisbury teams go to Piscataqua for cannon, etc. So there's another wonderful letter by Benjamin Greenleaf that's sent off to Boston. He says, the committee of this town think that if some heavier cannon than we are at present in possession of can be obtained, it will be prudent to place them in a convenient part of this harbor in order to prevent any mischief being done by cutters or other armed vessels. And so I love that, mischief being done to us by cutters or other vessels. So everybody's thinking about fortifying the harbor. In fact, they say the Salisbury teams went to Piscataqua for a cannon. So the cannon that are at Piscataqua, it's an interesting question because Graham just told you that the townsfolk busted into the fort and stole some cannon. So, Portsmouth has some cannon to lend. They can't use them because they're fortified. So Newburyport goes overland to take these cannon from Portsmouth. And they end up coming back with some cannon, and they say they're going to borrow the cannon against mischief. And they come back with on July 8th, a 24-pounder and a 32-pounder. These are massive guns, humongous guns. These are really coastal defense guns from the French and Indian War. And now they're coming to Newburyport. So we're putting enormous guns on Plum Island and Salisbury at this point. And then they say they're going to put them on Hook's Point.
Voted Captain, where's Hook's Point? Well, that's a real question. Does anybody know? Because we don't. It doesn't come up on any charts or maps or anything.
We really don't know.
We really have no idea. But we suspect that One of these is Hook's Point, even though they have different names. This is Black Rocks, that's Badger's Rocks, and that's Salisbury Point, which I take offense to because Lowell's Boat Shop is actually on Salisbury Point. But we suspect that Hook's Point is over here somewhere, and what you will see as we go through some of these charts, certainly this Salisbury side has changed. It changed every year, certainly every 10 years, and so in that time, there's all likelihood there was some sort of point of land out there that has long since gone out to sea, but we don't really know. So if anyone hears any reference to Hook's Point, sees a Hook's Point Road in Salisbury, anything like that, just let us know.
Absolutely. We asked so many people where Hook's Point was.
But this is, can I talk for a minute?
Oh, yeah.
Great.
Absolutely.
So this is interesting, though, to look at. So this is 1806. So this is an earlier chart, and it does show the piers pretty plainly here. It's just a tough scale. But if you talk about Newburyport as a place to come into, you've got these breakers out here, much like today, and it's a fairly straight shot, but also fairly narrow. And if you're coming and going, certainly by the time you get here, you're committed, and you might not know what's going on inside, but when you get there, you're really committed, and you start to see these piers and all these people hanging out waiting to get you. And so it's an uninviting place on a good day, and one that you wouldn't want to go into.
Oh, my goodness, there's a close-up. I think we were just trying to show you what Hook's Point is. There it is. We think. Prove us wrong. Okay. By the end of July, on July 25th, there is a notice that the Committee for Building the Piers near the Black Rocks, having finished their business, so whatever piers they were going to build have been finished, are set out that those who have accounts against the town of Newburyport for said piers, bring them to the committee by the end of, so anyway, we'll pay you for the piers that are built. So there's proof that they're done, they're in. Then on the 27th, there's another interesting record. There is a shipping from the Caribbean, from the West Indies, is being diverted into Newburyport Harbor. And this is, Newburyport is actually becoming the center of coastal trade. We sort of really are the center of the universe. Sorry. Voted that this committee inform the Committee of Correspondence of Piscataqua that the vessel that was supposed to go to Piscataqua was here laden with rum and sugar, and this committee thought it was not safe for the said brigantine to go from hence with the said cargo, as there was a man of war lying there, and it was reported by Mr. Fisher that Admiral Graves had given out that he had or should order all vessels inward and outward bound to be taken by his cruisers. That's what that text on the bottom says. So they're actually going out into the ocean and calling in ships that are destined for Portsmouth. What are these, Graham?
Well, and it makes sense too when you think about where ships can go relative to Boston. So if Graves had Boston blockaded, likely from like Cohasset and up past Salem Sound, so ships couldn't get into Salem. Salem Sound is close enough to Gloucester that Gloucester is effectively blocked off as well. There really aren't any options south of Boston for a big port for big ships to come in. So the next closest thing is actually the Merrimack River and Newburyport. But as we look through these charts and talk about how horrible the river is to get in and out of, they allocated some whaleboats to protect any vessel that may be desirous to come into this harbor. So what we're lacking potentially are pilots, or maybe we have them but not enough boats. And they would have stationed these just inside Plum Island Point or maybe over on the Salisbury side. And if they saw a ship running for the harbor, would have gone out to meet it, put someone aboard who could get it safely in through the bar, through the mouth, and then eventually through the piers that were there as well. And so in these days, a chase at sea was not uncommon. It was a very slow thing, like two scooters chasing each other. And you could see them from a long way off, and if you could get out to that ship ahead of time, you could also, with a couple of guns and a whaleboat, fight off a small privateer or some such if it were going to take the ship. But that's what they were doing. And these were early whaleboats of the day, probably about 25 feet open boats, the sort of thing that often boardmen would use. We'll talk about him later, your boyfriend.
I have so many. Oh, you haven't sat down yet. I'm confused. Okay, I'm up. You're ready. So yeah, one of the assumptions that I brought to this project was that the whaleboats were on board a larger vessel and then were deployed from that vessel out in the harbor. But there was a lot more shore-based whaling at the time, 1775, than there was actually ship-based whaling. So it's whaleboats were designed to be launched from shore as well. So that changed my vision of whaleboats. There were 4 of them. Each of the whaleboats were manned by 10 men. So there are 40 men in 4 whaleboats on Plum Island waiting to guard a vessel that wants to come into the harbor. Later in July, they voted that the consideration of the necessity of a guard at the battery at the salt works be kept. And then Abel Greenleaf offers his sloop for a guard vessel at the piers. So again, we're guarding a little, we'll look at a map in a minute, but we're guarding closer to Newburyport itself, a little further up the river. And then they also, William Coffin is going to Newbury, Salisbury, and Amesbury to see if any of them will be willing to man the vessel that's at the piers. So let's look at this map. So want to talk about the salt works?
Go ahead if you want.
Okay, there they are. There's the salt works. So you can see if they have cannon at Hooks Point here, and they've got piers here. Now they're somewhere on the salt works, probably near the piers. They are stationing, they're defending the salt works as well. So they're basically fortifying the harbor from the outside in. On September 12th, Admiral Samuel Graves, who's just about the most hated guy by Newburyporters at this time, writes to Captain James Wallace, who's recently returned from bombarding and burning Stonington, Connecticut, looking for beef. Not like, beef like trouble with somebody you don't like, but actual beef. He said, "We have brought in many outward bound ships with vessels with lumber, horses, fish, etc. I will appoint some vessel to cruise in the Sound the moment it is in my power. In the meantime, attend to the information I send you of vessels from abroad going to Newburyport and Dartmouth, which it seems are the places for vessels to push for." So September 1775, your 2 choices are Dartmouth and Newburyport. Sort of amazing exactly how important it was. And then on September 25th, the Committee of Safety voted to choose a committee to look out for and engage a proper vessel for a guarda-coast. Term I had never heard before. This is September 25th, 1775. They're looking for a guarda-coast vessel. To nominate a proper master, and the next 3 men in command inquire how many men are willing to serve, et cetera, et cetera. They want to take their subscriptions. They want a shipping paper. Anyway, so they're all into this. They also get 2 6-pound guns for the use of the fort at Salisbury. So we know that that's in place at that point. September 26th, the next day, they vote that Captain William Wire is going to be the master of the said guarda-coast vessel. He accepts, and then they figure maybe they should probably ask George Washington before they put an armed vessel out to sea. So September 27th, the Newburyport Committee of Safety writes to the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and says, "We beg leave to represent that the harbor of this town is so obstructed by nature and so blocked up by piers which have been sunk at the mouth of it, that it is fitted for and has become an asylum for many vessels who seek to avoid the piratical ships of our enemies. There are many small armed vessels cruising along the shores of the province and frequently crossing this bay," etc. So they write for page after page after page, all the reasons why we should have a guarda-coast. September 28th, the Committee of Safety sends Captain William Coombs to represent the town, respecting the guarda-coast. They use this term over and over again. And that Captain Coombs be directed to sign an agreement with the committee to produce such a vessel. And George Washington says no, thank you, but no. And that was a bit of a puzzle for us, because why would George Washington turn down the offer of an armed vessel from Newburyport? And in his letters, he writes that he is uncertain about the chain of command for such a vessel. Things are still sort of uncertain about how, this is before the Declaration of Independence. This is early, and George Washington is a little bit concerned about things getting out of hand and a bunch of armed vessels, going all over the place without any structure or any chain of command. So we never got our Garda Coast. October 6th. Would you like to talk about Machias?
I'll talk about Machias. October 6th. Well, let's see here. So Machias stuck a stick in the eye of Graves. So the siege of Boston, they sent some ships up to Machias. Anybody know where Machias is? You go to Maine, you just keep going until it almost runs out. Big tides, terrible place to get into, not unlike Newburyport. So sent some ships up there with a guard ship, the Marguerite, to basically convoy them up and load up some provisions to take back to Boston. And there was a loyalist merchant up there who they were dealing with, and he was disliked by the town. And so when the ship showed up, all the townspeople showed up with pitchforks and took the trading ships, and then chased the Marguerite and finally took her as well. And then for the rest of the war, actually, Machias kind of wreaked havoc on the British. But that crossed Graves to begin with, and he started to get a little upset.
He did. This is Admiral Graves, by the way, here on the left. So in a letter on October 6th, he writes to the commander of the one that starts with the C, the Chanceau.
The
Canso, whose name is Mowat. He writes to him, whereas the 4 New England governments are in open and avowed rebellion against His Majesty, and they have been daring enough to make seizures of several of His Majesty's ships and vessels and send their crews to prison. So he goes on and on about all the terrible things that we've done to the British vessels. And then he says, he's issuing orders right now. He says, my design is to chastise Marblehead, Salem, Newburyport, Cape Ann, Portsmouth, Ipswich, Saco, Falmouth, which is now Portsmouth and Casco Bay, and particularly Machias, where the Marguerite was taken. Graves holds a grudge. And then in June, again, he's thinking about June 1775 when the Battle of Machias took place, which is also known as the Battle of the Margaretta, or the Marguerite, and is still celebrated today by the good people of Machias. In his same letter, he says, you are to go to all of the named places and make the most vigorous effort to burn the towns and destroy all shipping in the harbors. So he names Newburyport specifically and says, go burn her. So, we had good reason to be concerned. All right, and then he does it. You want to talk about this?
Sure. So this is Mowat, who we just talked about, who's a lieutenant. And Graves didn't have a lot of ships to spare. He was busy in Boston, and there were some bigger things going on. So he sent Mowat in the Canso. And the Canso is an unrated ship. So in the Royal Navy, when you have an unrated ship, it is commanded by a lieutenant typically. And when you're a lieutenant and you have a ship under your command, you're basically trying not to screw up. You're trying to distinguish yourself, but also trying not to screw up. And Mowat had been up to Casco Bay earlier in the summer, or maybe the previous fall, I can't remember the dates. And the people up there were pretty rebellious, and he was anchored in the harbor, and he went ashore. They were trying to get the ship out of there, and Mowat himself went ashore and was trying to work out church services for his crew. And a bunch of local rebels, led by a guy named Thompson, apprehended him and basically kept him prisoner and tried to get the ship to leave, get on out of here. And the ship sent crew ashore to try to rescue him, and they were unsuccessful. And finally, they brought the Canso in front of the town and started to fire blanks, at which point they let Mowat go. But he was unable to apprehend his captors, and he was sent off with a stick in his craw, shall we say. So when he was given those orders, he bypassed a lot of the earlier ports and went straight to Falmouth and burnt Portland to the ground, Falmouth. And that was really the only success of that mission. And if you think about it, a guy in charge of a ship, he was a young man, trying not to screw up, you have Cape Ann, which is pretty heavily guarded. Then you have the Merrimack River, which is pretty heavily guarded and hard to get into. And then you've got Portsmouth, which he'd been to previously in the war, in the Canso. He showed up actually before the Scarborough, but the local pilot ran him aground, and he spent about a week aground in Portsmouth, so he didn't want to go back there. Saco, you have a tidal river with a tough entrance. You don't want to go in there and lose your ship. So Falmouth was a pretty easy target for him. There's not a lot to hit. You're not going to lose your ship up there. And so up he went. Well, the piers aren't enough. We've got to build ourselves a floating battery. Do you want to talk about all the scribble writing?
Yeah, I'll talk about the scribble writing.
Okay.
I have a master's degree in scribble writing. It's fabulous. So right after Falmouth, Portland is burned, obviously, you can see the direct result of these orders, like go burn all these towns, and now one of them has just been destroyed. So Newburyport is losing its mind. So this is another moment where there's a sudden flurry of activity, everyone's panicking. And on October 21st, the Committee of Safety voted that in the opinion of this committee, it's expedient for the town to build a floating battery. They voted that 3 entrenchments be thrown up at the east end of town. Now they're defending the town itself and not just the harbor. They vote that 3 people be chosen to view Plum Island and Salisbury Points to find a proper place to make a defense. Voted that any such, this is fascinating, and this is, I was so excited to find this. Such a number of vessels be immediately provided as shall effectively secure this harbor and move them down as soon as may be. So they're taking people's boats and moving them out into the harbor. Now, I was trying to figure out why, but we find out why a little bit later. And then they agree that they're going to pay the owners of the boats that are taken. They want to purchase a large quantity of logs and build some more piers. And they say, particularly, that the vessels will be taken, these ships will be taken for the use of the town, more piers. And then they say, we're writing again to Amesbury, Salisbury, and we're asking them each to build and bring a pair of 5 rafts of their own construction and without lots of time, meaning build us some rafts and get them out here. Post haste, then they vote to join the town of Newbury in building a breastwork upon Plum Island. And I mean, it goes on for page after page after page. They are very worried about everything. They vote that Captain Coffin, this is one of my favorites. They vote and vote and vote and vote. And then one of the last votes is, they vote that Captain Coffin be joined to the committee for building the piers in place of Moses Hoyt, who utterly refuses to serve. Moses Hoyt was like, I'm out. Put Coffin in here. And on October 24th, the town of Newburyport records record that Captain Hudson will be the captain of Fort Merrimack, if approved by Salisbury and Amesbury. So we've now named the fort that's in Salisbury. So a floating battery is a fascinating question. There are no images of a floating battery during the American Revolution, so we had to do a little digging.
Well, there's a little bit of an image, and this is one such thing. So it's actually a British floating battery that was built in Lake Champlain, and this is the little drawing that we have. Up in the upper left, that's actually a plan of that vessel. It's very involved, which you would expect from the Royal Navy, but you can look, it's pretty boxy. It's not something that ever would have gone to sea, but it could kind of make its way around a lake and wreak havoc. The only other obvious reference that I found to a floating battery was actually in the Charles River. So this was built in Cambridge, 2 of these, sort of breastworks on a flat boat, on a scow, and they floated them out into the Charles and were firing upon the British soldiers that were encamped on Boston Common. They did no harm to the British, but they killed a lot of themselves when one of the cannon blew up. So unsuccessful, but we had to have them in Newburyport. So what did we likely have? We had a lot of these kinds of vessels here, these scows, these gondolas, as we saw earlier. Very easy to take one of these and put a couple of cannon on it, build a little wall, and float it out there. Very maneuverable. And a floating battery was basically another deterrent. And if you think about where the piers were in the river, you have land is pretty far away once you get to the piers. You're inside of Salisbury and Plum Island Point, And once you get in there, the marsh is way back, Woodbridge Island is way over, and you can't really get hit from anywhere, from the salt works maybe. But having a floating battery in the middle of the channel as you're coming into the harbor would be a deterrent at that point, just another layer of defense to get through.
Thank you. All right, so also in October, at the end of October, we have a letter from, I want to say Timothy Dalton, but it's not, it's Tristram Dalton. I always make that mistake. Tristram Dalton is writing a letter to Elbridge Gerry, who some of you may have heard. Some of you may have heard of him. I'm not going to tell that story right now.
I'm going to ask you in the questions.
Okay, fine. And he says, yeah, there's a whole bunch of pleasantries, and then he says, this is awesome, we have daily applications for powder, some towns in real distress, particularly Beverly. To Portsmouth in their present danger we have spared, though almost guilty of sacrilege to ourselves. This town is doing everything in their power to serve themselves, filling up the channel, building a floating battery, fire rafts. So these rafts are not just to block the channel, they're going to light them on fire. That was amazing to find. Entrenchments, etc., for which I refer to Mr. Cross, who's, anyway, Stephen Cross. And then they also vote to choose a committee of 5. So now they're not only, they fortified the harbor, they're fortifying up the river, and now they're worrying about the defense of the town itself. And so they choose committees that are going to go to the top of every steeple in Newburyport, and they're going to have a series of signals, so if there is an invasion, they can warn everyone. So they have a constant watch in the steeples of the churches of Newburyport for ships coming into the harbor. So it is a scary time. They fixed 3 port riders, so there are 3 men on fast horses who can ride from the port to get help. They have an evacuation plan all the way up the Merrimack to go up into New Hampshire. This is really real business. And they have a committee to observe the motions of the enemy and report should they get above the piers. And then they vote that a committee of 3 be chosen to take care of the 5 rafts that are a-coming from the other towns. So things are getting real, as they say. So British Colonel Kemble, who was a friend of Mowat's and Graves, said, there is a boom or strong chain. This is not our harbor, this is Portsmouth Harbor. Portsmouth Harbor has thrown a boom or strong chain, which is raised or lowered by a windlass on either side, and all the vessels from Cape Ann are in the Newbury River, except a small, and the mouth of it shut up by driving piles or stakes in the bottom, except a small passage which is left open for vessels where a raft is moored to be sunk occasionally. They don't know we're going to light our rafts on fire. And then on November 4th, they are worrying about money. They're talking about cannon again. And then, let's see, okay. Wait, I'll back up to that. Listen to this. Admiral Graves says, I'm extremely concerned about the badness of Mowat's vessels and stores, preventing his doing more than destroying just the town of Falmouth. This is a severe stroke to the rebels. So he inadvertently lays out exactly what Portsmouth, Newburyport, and Boston are doing in a sort of a chain. He says, Falmouth was long a principal magazine of all kinds of merchandise, from whence, besides supplying the scattered villages in the province of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, large quantities of goods were transported in small vessels to Newburyport, and from thence by land to the rebel army round Boston. And what we have in, what we've found here, this is from August 1775, this is a very, very faded receipt for transporting 40 firearms from Newburyport to Watertown. They had managed to purchase 40 guns from the French, probably from the French West Indies. It had gone into Falmouth or Portland, had been smuggled into Newburyport, and was on its way to Watertown. We're up in all this business. All right, and then November 20th, Captain James Hudson says, okay, so they've fortified Salisbury enough that they now want to fortify, make an actual fort on Plum Island and fortify it, that. So they withdraw the guard and house the guns and carriages from Salisbury while they're building a fort on Plum Island, which we first thought, well, maybe it's winter and they're not expecting a fight, but it does seem that they are basically taking the cannon and moving them to Plum Island. So what else is happening? Oh, yep, they're going to settle with the persons who've been in the service of the town on board the piers. And then they say, and they start asking for money. So we are concerned about getting our money back. So we send, oh, here we go. This is Tristram Dalton. Nope, this is not Tristram Dalton. Hold on one second. This is Jonathan Jackson, Jonathan Lowell, and Tristram Dalton. There we go. And they all go to the committee, they go to Massachusetts legislature, basically, and they ask to be reimbursed for all the money that we have spent fortifying the town. And in that, they say that we need to be relieved of the heavy expense accrued for the sinking of the piers and the sending of expresses, et cetera. It's expensive sending mail. So we need our money back, is basically what they're saying. So this is in December 1775. This is when they first start saying we've been very important in the defense of Cape Ann and we'd like to be paid back. There's another in January. We're talking about finishing more piers. So this act to put in more piers is still ongoing. But we also have another sort of smoking gun record, which is in the Committee of Safety. Captain Samuel Newhall brought his account of the charge of vessels and men carried down to the piers to be sunk. So those ships that were taken from the town were not taken to be sailed out. They were taken to be sunk if the harbor was invaded, actually sunk in the harbor. So that was that little sort of smoking gun bit of information. So you want to talk about the piers?
Yes, I do. So what you're going to see, this looks a lot like the earlier chart because it is a lot like the earlier chart, but it's actually dated 1847. So they voted for more timber and to finish the piers and all that, and they were pretty formidable. And like I said, if you go look at that old wharf by the sewer treatment plant, the fact that it's still there means that these piers also were going to be long-lived. And so it's 1847.
Oh, sorry.
And there are your piers still sunk in the river, but the hump sands have moved north and swallowed up about 3 of them already by 1847. Now you can go. Now we're in 1884, and this is a very cool chart if you have time to look at it, because it shows how the topography has changed over the years. There's 1878, 1880, 1883, the river mouth is moving around. They've started to construct the jetties because the river mouth is moving around so much. You've got a fort over here. Current day Salisbury Shore basically goes from here right along to Black Rocks. This is all gone, including that fort. But the interesting thing here is that sunken piers removed 1880. So 100 years later, these things were enough of a navigational hazard in the river that they had to be physically removed by a dredge to get them out of there. And they're all still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right there, right off of Black Rocks, right off of and the monument there is Butler's Toothpick, which is there at the time.
Awesome. Okay, so they're still talking about, they're still guarding Plum Island by 1770, by late 75 and early 76, we're really much more focused on privateering. We're much more outgoing than inward facing, but we still have a fort on Plum Island. On May 8th, 1776, we are voting to, again, erect a fort on Plum Island. And then there is a lovely record from June 27th, 1777, voted to allow the soldiers stationed on Plum Island candles and sweetening for their beer. So, like me, they're paid in beer. All right. So, 10 years later, 10 years after this incredible year of defending the harbor, we still want our money back. So there's a wonderful sort of wrap-up petition that goes to the Massachusetts General Court. The petition of the town of Newburyport humbly shows that in the years 1775 and 1776, the said town, in order to guard and defend themselves and the neighboring towns from the apprehended invasions and attacks of the enemy then infesting the seacoasts and making depredations on the maritime towns of the state, prepared and sunk a number of piers in the channel of the Merrimack River near the mouth thereof. They also built a fort on the Salisbury side of said river and another fort on Plum Island near the entrance of the harbor. They constructed a floating battery, built a barge, and made a number of gun carriages, the whole expense whereof amounted to the sum of £2,433, a shilling, and 2.5 pence. as by the accounts will be basically we'll be sending you the bill. Those works were the means of preventing the enemy from entering the harbor and spreading destruction through this part of the state. At the same time, it rendered it a safe asylum for vessels belonging to Boston, then in the power of the enemy, and those belonging to Marblehead, Cape Ann, and all exposed maritime towns. So we were fully taking credit for saving coastal New England 10 years after the Revolution, and I don't think we were wrong to do so. They also said we made provision for supplying the fort on Plum Island with guns, ammunitions, and stores, and maintaining a garrison there for a considerable time. So this was not a fly-by-night operation. So that is that sort of ends the panic of defending the harbor in 1775, but I'll give you a little sort of postscript. As Graham mentioned, I'm pretty obsessed with Offen Boardman, who some of you may have heard me talk about before. I met him 25 years ago at Spencer Pierce Little Farm. And Offen Boardman's claim to fame, he's also my fourth cousin. We didn't do our inbred townie bingo chart, but anyway, so Offen Boardman is probably best known for capturing 2 British ships in one day in January 1776. And I just, in the process of researching this, found the letter of marque for his ship Washington. I've never been able to find it, I just came across it. So that was pretty cool. But the way that Offen Boardman captured 2 ships in one day is not incredibly clear. What the record says, which is most of it's written after his lifetime, is that he was out cruising in his privateer Washington. He saw a smaller vessel named the Suki. He approached it aggressively, it struck its colors, and he took it into Newburyport as a prize. And then he saw a much larger ship called the Friends, Captain Archibald Bowie, and he knew that he was not going to be able to take it by threatening it with his little vessel. And so he went he went in a whaleboat, and it's always seemed to me that he dropped these whaleboats from the Washington, right? Isn't that, Ellie's been teaching this school event for years. And I then, going through this, realized that I think he picked up a whaleboat from Plum Island and rowed it out, because he had and it was not unusual to have 10 men on a whaleboat, on a pilot boat. So he pretended to be a pilot. That's how he tricked them, the second boat, to come into Newburyport. So my entire understanding of that process has kind of changed. Yes?
If I had to guess, I'd say the wind was fair to get the first 2 ships into Newburyport, but not to get out. So his only way out was to row the whaleboats back into the wind and get this other British ship, and the wind was still fair to take that into the port too.
See why I keep them around? Love it. All right, so we're gonna end. I should say, thus ends the lesson, being in a church and all. But this is Offen Boardman's. So the contemporary record about these seizures never mentions Offen Boardman by name. I think it was a much more of a group effort than later generations said. But he took this ship in, and it made international news. In fact, George Washington was informed immediately about these 2 ships that were taken in one day. 64 firkins of tongue, among other things. No, thank you. So, lessons from Newburyport, 1775. Here we go. There's immense power in collective action. It was amazing how many messages were going back and forth from all of these towns to each other, asking about powder, borrowing a cannon, trying to figure out, can you man this vessel? We'll man this other vessel. All right. Liberty, equality, and the right to self-determination are worth fighting for. These people, in all of their writing to other committees of safety, were talking about the lofty goals of their rebellion, their revolution. Look after one another. There was a lot of that going on. Keep your powder dry. There was a lot of discussion of gunpowder. Newburyport is, in fact, the center of the universe. This is what we've all discovered, right? We can all agree on that. And Amesbury's never going to pay up. Amesbury in the balcony. I see you. Amesbury. So that's all we have to say about that. Thank you all so much. So now we have to share a microphone, because we've sent our husband out into the crowd to take any questions that you may have.
Question, I'll bring you a mic. we get paid back?
Did we get paid back? No. That's the short answer.
Hey, who's we?
Newburyport. For defending the harbor. No. Sadly, no. We never. You knew that answer. You knew that was coming. Oh, you sure can.
Is there any connection between Admiral Graves, the British Admiral Graves, and the Graves family of Newbury?
I am so glad you asked that question, Kathy. Kathy has been reading the Graves letters of Newburyport. So when I came across Admiral Graves, I did a whole bunch of research and I can find no connection. But I know that's probably for the best. Yeah.
Could you just explain soundings, like how they did that?
Soundings in the age of the Revolution was very complicated. They took a piece of lead on a rope and dropped it to the bottom, and when it stopped, that's how deep you had. So it's a little more complicated than that. In that if they were, say they were going to chart the river mouth, they would have come with, if they were going to do it properly, they would have had a couple of different teams with sextants, and you can actually make a map pretty quickly by moving targets around and taking sextant angles. Basically, it's called a plane table map. And then if you have a boat out there, they can take soundings and you can locate them on your chart and basically make a rudimentary chart of the river. But they weren't looking for, a chart with, like we have today with soundings everywhere. They were looking for a line with a bunch of depths on it that they could follow when they came into the river. But it was a lot of these British Admiralty charts are, if you look at some of the older ones, even some of the newer ones, the data still dates back to the 1700s. And so like the Scarborough spent a year anchored up in Portsmouth. They weren't just sitting on the ship, they were actually out surveying the harbor most days, I have to imagine, trying to make a better chart of the place. And they were occupying their time doing things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm trying to picture the harbor in those days. They had piers that were partially sunk. You could see them on the surface, or you couldn't see them. They were hidden, the ones that they sunk.
Again, it's hard to tell from the photographs, but I have to imagine that some portion was out of the water at high tide because they were obstructions. But the talk of bringing ships down to sink them at the piers and the raft to sink in between the piers, they were also something you could tie off to. And so I would imagine there was some portion of them that was out of the water. Now, by the time 1880 came around, they were probably mostly ripped down by ice and all that, and were piles of rocks with logs coming out of them, but still a navigational hazard. But by that time, if you look at those charts, the navigational channel had kind of moved north, and they weren't really in the way. And I think they became more in the way when they built the jetties, and that sort of, the channel would move around significantly over the years prior to the jetties, but the purpose of the jetties was to make the navigational channel pretty consistent. And I'm guessing at that time, those piers became a problem.
But friendly ships could come in. If somebody knew where all the hazards were and could still bring in the ships to supply.
Yeah, they made sure that there was an opening in the piers, but you had to know where it was.
So all of the trade was blockaded going into Boston, Salem, that area. Was all of that coming into Newburyport, or was a lot of that trade just really completely shut down?
Well, I mean, there are ships coming back from voyages that don't know that Boston is blockaded, for sure. So, like that ship from St. Christopher that they grab and bring into Newburyport. I mean, trade certainly was hampered by the blockade in Boston and Portsmouth, but there definitely still were cargoes coming into Newburyport, and there were some cargoes still landing in Gloucester and Salem and, you know, unoccupied ports. But I think the thing that was astonishing was how much was still coming into Newburyport, and then going overland. I mean, Newburyport's basically supplying the Boston troops at this point. They're getting the goods coming into Newburyport and then bringing them overland to Boston. So certainly less than if those weren't blockaded, but trade was still coming in. And those guns that I referenced, they were part of a cargo that was brought from the French West Indies into Newburyport. So they're still buying from the French. We're buying arms from the French.
I'm going to add to that.
I don't know.
Okay, I think in the day, and this is all conjecture, but if you were risk averse, you tied your ships up somewhere safe, and you stopped sending them to sea for fear that they'd be taken. But if you were not risk averse, I think there was a premium paid for goods that could come in, and so if you were trying to blockade run and get stuff into Newburyport, it was worth your while if you could do it. And so it was probably a select number of faster ships that were doing that, certainly by the time the word of the war had broken out.
Yeah, I also just want to say, I think the incredible thing about this research for me has been these people had no idea how this was going to roll out. Like, nobody knew it was going to happen, and that's the joy of studying history, right? You get to see what it was like. But people were constantly trying to decide if they were going to make a short-term decision or a long-term one, because, you know, how long were we going to be in this situation? And there were debates about that. You know, how much do you close up the harbor? Because this might be over next week, and we're going to want to go right back to where we were before. One of the biggest debates in the Committee of Safety Records was about whether or not they were going to kill the spring lambs, because everybody wanted to eat lamb. They were raising lamb, and they didn't want to let them get a year older and eat mutton. And they you know, said, no, you can't eat your lambs because we need mutton later. There's more of it later in the season. So, but they went on for pages and pages in the record. Can we kill the lambs?
What a great saying.
What?
You can't eat your lamb because we need mutton later.
Can't eat your lamb, we need mutton later. Exactly. Mutton dressed as lamb.
Let's get so many uses, colloquial uses.
Did I see another question back here?
Thank you. I would like to ask if you know of any information about the church steeples that were used. Is there any record from any of the churches of that information?
That is an excellent question. It doesn't specify which churches in the record. It just says voted to repair to the highest steeples of the town and worn. So, I mean, I think we can guess that I'm sure Old South somebody was in Old South, somebody was definitely in what is now FRS. I don't know that somebody would be here, but I think, I mean, Old South would have been crucial because you can today stand in that steeple and see out to the harbor. I don't know if the churches have any records of this, but it would be very interesting. I think Kathy was. There were absolutely riders that were being sent up, and there was a system in place. You know, this Paul Revere situation didn't happen out of nowhere. In fact, Paul Revere had already ridden up to the Piscataqua before he did the ride. I mean, there was a system, sort of a relay system in place to warn people. But for some reason, by the time it got to Newburyport, they just weren't sure whether it was a rumor or a true.
Ever use the Merrimack River to get goods back and forth and to transport people down through Concord and Lexington? Because I know the Native Americans would come up here in the summer
That is an interesting question. I have only ever seen, in the process of researching this, I only saw records of them going overland. I don't know why that would be, but that doesn't mean they didn't.
I have no knowledge of that.
Yeah, which is funny, because you would think that they would use the Merrimack to travel in that way. Would you be going upstream? It would be hard to get
You
from
couldn't
Newburyport.
take anything of any size, but to the Merrimack to the Concord River, you mean?
That is worth looking into more.
Yeah.
That's an excellent question. Jimmy, we got some in the back of the room over there.
You mentioned Fort William, we have in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And if I'm not mistaken, it's a silent claims that's when the first shot was actually fired. By that.
Yeah, absolutely. In Portsmouth, you're saying there's a claim that the first shot of the Revolution was shot in Portsmouth? At the site, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's, Portsmouth certainly has a claim on that, right?
Yeah, they definitely do, and that was a full, 4 months?
Yeah, before
Lexington and Concord. But again, there were only 6 people up there defending that fort, and I think they were easily overrun. And I don't know if they got any shots off or not. Nobody was killed. Some people were hurt.
How was the dog?
The dog, I'm told, made it and it's actually still alive.
Oh, amazing. Can I adopt it?
But no, they did supposedly fire some shots from the fort at the oncoming crowd, but it didn't do any harm.
As you've been telling the story, it sounds like the decisions were all made locally as to what was going to happen and what it looked like. Did the state legislature provide any kind of guidance or coordination?
You are absolutely right that a lot of decisions were made to pursue a course of action, but those courses of action were almost always checked with the provincial Congress. So, when they were deciding that they were going to outfit a boat and go out into the harbor, they had to wait. They were going back and forth significantly. Things like fortifying the harbor, I think that needed to be done quickly. And so they sent sort of a general, we're going to do this, and then they just did it. But it really was, it was pretty local. But the letters are also going back and forth between Newburyport, Hampton, Piscataqua. I mean, they're constantly communicating with neighboring towns and, like I said, borrowing things, lending each other cannon and powder. And, there's no way that this would have been as successful if there wasn't such a high level of cooperation and communication between these towns. But, Massachusetts was informed. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all so much. Want to say anything?
Thank you all so much.
Graham says thank you all so much too. Thank you for coming out, and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you. And thank you to Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism.